The fog rolled thick off the North Atlantic that spring morning in 1888, shrouding the grimy docks of Cinder Harbor in a gray veil that seemed to muffle even hope itself. Through the mist came the sound of creaking timber and desperate voices, families clutching their meager possessions as they sought passage to the promised lands of New Eden. They came with dreams of prosperity, carrying everything they owned in worn trunks and canvas bags, their children's eyes wide with wonder at the towering ships that promised to carry them to salvation across the treacherous waters. What they could not know as they counted their precious coins and studied the departure schedules posted on salt-stained boards was that some of those belongings would outlive them by decades. In the pawnshops of distant ports, far from the smoke and sorrow of Cinder Harbor, their treasured possessions would find new owners who never questioned the stories of salvage and maritime tragedy that accompanied each sail. For 3 long years, entire families vanished on the shipping routes between Cinder Harbor and the New World. The official record spoke of storms and accidents, the cruel mathematics of maritime commerce that claimed a predictable percentage of souls with each passing season. Maritime authorities nodded gravely at reports of vessels lost to the treacherous waters around the Gray Serpent Isles, filing death certificates with practiced efficiency and offering condolences to families who would never see their loved ones again. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury. But the most nauseating truth was yet to be discovered, hidden beneath layers of forged documentation and practiced lies. What investigators would eventually uncover was not simply murder for profit, though the financial gains were substantial. It was something far more grotesque, a ritualistic consumption that fed both body and twisted belief, a systematic enterprise that transformed desperate emigrants into both commodity and sacrament. This is the story of the merchant vessel Widow's Wake and the ledger that counted not just silver and gold, but souls consumed in service to an ancient and hungry creed. Cinder Harbor was a town built on soot and sorrow, its towering smokestacks belching black clouds into a sky that seemed perpetually caught between dusk and dawn. The cobblestones of its winding streets ran slick with grease and seawater, creating treacherous footing for the desperate souls who navigated its maze of warehouses and tenements. The air itself was a physical presence, thick with coal smoke, rotting fish, and the particular desperation that clung to places where people gathered to flee their past lives. This was where the Industrial Revolution came to die, where the great promise of mechanization and prosperity had collapsed under the weight of economic reality. Factories stood empty, their broken windows staring blindly at streets filled with the unemployed and the dispossessed. Families who had once trusted in steady wages and secure futures now found themselves with nothing but debts and the growing certainty that salvation, if it existed at all, lay across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The emigrants who gathered at the docks each gray morning were not tourists or adventurers seeking exotic experiences. These were people with nothing left to lose, mothers clutching infants who coughed from the constant smoke, fathers whose hands shook from the weight of having failed to provide for those who depended on them. They carried their lives in worn carpetbags and wooden chests, everything they owned condensed into packages small enough to fit in a ship's cramped passenger compartments. They spoke in hushed tones of New Eden, the colonial territories across the Atlantic where land was cheap and work was plentiful, where a man could build something lasting with his own hands. The shipping companies that promised to deliver them to this promised land operated from offices that smelled of pipe tobacco and ledger ink, their walls decorated with charts of shipping lanes and advertisements for passenger services. But between Cinder Harbor and Salvation lay the Gray Serpent Archipelago, a maze of fog-shrouded islands and hidden reefs that had claimed more ships than any captain cared to count. The shipping lanes twisted through channels barely wide enough for a brigantine, where the slightest miscalculation could dash a vessel against granite cliffs that rose like tombstones from the black water. Once a ship cleared the harbor and disappeared into that gray maze, no authority on earth could reach it. The captain became absolute monarch of his floating kingdom, his word as final as any earthly power. Passengers who paid their fare bought not just passage, but trust, faith that the man at the helm would deliver them safely to their new lives. Into this world of hope and hardship sailed a ship that was not salvation, but predator. Captain Silas Rook stood 6 feet tall in his polished boots, with steel gray hair swept back from a high forehead and eyes the color of winter storms. He was a man who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect in every port, from the Baltic to the Caribbean, his weathered hands steady on wheel or Bible with equal confidence. When he spoke, which he did sparingly and with careful consideration, his deep voice carried the weight of someone who had seen the worst that men and weather could offer. He was a man who spoke scripture as easily as he spoke of weather and tides, able to quote chapter and verse from memory while simultaneously calculating tides and wind patterns. His cabin aboard the Widow's Wake was lined with theological texts and navigation charts in equal measure, creating an atmosphere where the divine and the practical merged into a single world view. When he walked the docks of Cinder Harbor on Sunday mornings, dressed in his finest black coat and carrying his leather-bound Bible, men touched their caps and women blessed themselves. Rook was known throughout the port community as a godly captain, one who held evening prayers on his deck, regardless of weather, and refused to sail on the Sabbath, even when substantial bonuses were offered. The Widow's Wake herself was a testament to both function and faith, a sturdy brigantine that had been meticulously maintained and subtly modified over her 20 years of service. Her black hull bore fresh paint that gleamed even in the gray light of Cinder Harbor's smoky atmosphere, while her brass fittings were polished to mirror brightness. She had been built in the shipyards of Newcastle during the height of the coal trade, designed for rough coastal waters where cargo mattered more than comfort. The conversion to passenger service had involved more than just accommodations. Deep in the ship's belly, hidden behind false bulkheads and accessible only to those who knew the proper sequences, were spaces that served purposes no passenger manifest would ever record. These chambers were lined with hooks and equipped with drainage systems, their walls bearing stains that casual inspection might mistake for rust. His crew was a tight-knit brotherhood of 15 men, hand-picked by Rook himself over 5 careful years. First Mate Abner Graves stood nearly as tall as his captain, but twice as broad, a former dock worker whose massive frame and scarred knuckles spoke of a youth spent settling disputes with physical force. The boatswain, cook, and able seamen moved with quiet efficiency, their individual personalities subsumed into collective identity that revolved around absolute loyalty to Captain Rook. What set this crew apart was their peculiar devotion to what they called the Creed of the Depths, a collection of maritime superstitions and half-remembered pagan rituals that older sailors dismissed as harmless nonsense. They spoke in whispers of ancient powers that dwelt in the deepest trenches, of bargains struck between desperate men and forces that predated civilization. But this brotherhood was bound by a secret darker than any could imagine. In the spring of 1888, Ansel O'Connell stood on the fog-shrouded docks of Cinder Harbor with his wife Bridget, their entire life reduced to the contents of a single wooden trunk that had belonged to his grandfather. The trunk was solid oak, built to last generations, but its brass hinges showed the green patina of age, and its leather straps had been repaired multiple times with careful stitching. Ansel was a blacksmith by trade, his massive forearms bearing the scars and calluses that came from 20 years at the forge. His hands, permanently stained with soot and marked by tiny burn scars, could shape red-hot iron with the precision of an artist. But the factory closures had left his skills worthless. The great mills that had once consumed his horseshoes and iron fittings now stood empty, their windows broken and their machinery sold for scrap. Bridget wore her grandmother's silver locket at her throat, a simple piece no larger than a child's palm, but engraved with intricate Celtic knots that seemed to shift and flow in the uncertain light. It was a family heirloom that had traveled from County Cork 3 generations earlier, the only valuable thing she owned and the only connection to ancestors she would never see again. They had saved for 2 long years to afford passage on any ship bound for New Eden, counting every penny with the desperate precision of people who understood that this represented their final chance at prosperity. They had sold their furniture piece by piece, pawned Ansel's tools despite knowing they would need them in the new land, and taken on extra work that left them exhausted but slowly accumulating the necessary funds. Captain Rook had found them in the boarding house where they waited for a ship they could afford, his presence filling the cramped room with authority that made other conversations pause. He spoke of Christian charity and his duty to help God's children reach the promised land, offering passage at rates that seemed impossibly generous. When Ansel expressed concern about the low fare, Rook smiled and quoted scripture about helping the least among them. The night before departure, Ansel wrote to his brother in County Cork, his excitement bleeding through every line despite his limited education. He described their cabin as small but clean, praised the captain's evening prayers, and spoke of the new life waiting in New Eden, where land was cheap and skilled metalwork was desperately needed. The Wake departed Cinder Harbor on a gray morning in April, her holds filled with 87 souls seeking salvation across the Atlantic. Among the passengers were the O'Connells, a family of German farmers with 6 children, a Welsh mining engineer and his pregnant wife, and 24 others whose names filled the passenger manifest with hope and determination. Weeks passed, then months. The families waiting in New Eden checked shipping registers daily, but the widow's Wake never arrived at her destination port. Captain Rook never reported to the colonial harbor master. The 87 passengers simply vanished into the gray waters of the North Atlantic, their fate written off as another tragedy of the sea. But in October of that same year, a pawnbroker in the distant port of St. Anne's recorded the sale of a silver locket, its Celtic knots still gleaming despite months of wear. The seller was a sailor from the widow's Wake who claimed it had been salvaged from a shipwreck encountered during their voyage. He carried proper documentation, a bill of sale signed by Captain Rook himself. The O'Connells were just the first course in a long and bloody feast. Captain Rook understood the art of selection better than any predator that had ever stalked the waters of the North Atlantic. His hunting grounds were not the empty expanses of the open ocean, but the crowded boarding houses and emigrant hostels of Cinder Harbor, where desperation concentrated like sediment in still water. He studied his potential victims with the patience of a scholar and the instincts of a shark. He did not prey upon wealthy merchants or well-connected families whose disappearances would trigger investigations. Those passengers traveled on established shipping lines with connections to powerful trading houses, their movements tracked by networks of business associates who would notice delays and demand explanations. Their luggage bore marks of prosperity that could be traced. Their clothing was tailored by shops that maintained customer records. Instead, Rook targeted those whom society had already forgotten, the desperate souls who fled debtors' prisons with nothing but hopes that distance would erase their obligations. He sought out families displaced by factory closures, their former employers long bankrupt and their references meaningless in a world that had moved beyond their skills. The selection process began long before passengers ever set foot aboard the Widow's Wake. Rook maintained a network of informants among tavern keepers and boarding house operators who catered to the emigrant trade, men and women who could identify families with the right combination of desperation and isolation. He paid well for information about passengers who had quarreled with relatives, who had left their homeland under clouds of scandal, or who had made it known that they intended to sever all connections with their former lives. His sales pitch was a masterpiece of calculated trust, refined through years of practice until it could overcome even the most cautious resistance. Rook would appear at emigrant boarding houses just as families were realizing they could not afford passage on established shipping lines, his timing so precise that his arrival seemed like divine intervention rather than careful surveillance. He spoke of Christian charity with the conviction of genuine faith, quoting scripture with the fluency of someone who had spent years studying the text for purposes both sacred and profane. His particular favorite was the parable of the Good Samaritan, which allowed him to position himself as the unexpected helper who appeared just when hope seemed lost. The wake specialized in taking passengers that other captains turned away, building a reputation for Christian charity that attracted the most vulnerable emigrants. Families with too many children found that established shipping lines considered them disruptive. Elderly couples whose health was questionable were often rejected by captains who worried about deaths during voyages. Single mothers with infants were particularly unwelcome on most ships. Rook welcomed them all with open arms and gentle scripture, his generosity seeming to flow from genuine religious conviction rather than calculated malice. He spoke of Jesus's particular concern for widows and orphans, of the biblical commandment to care for strangers and foreigners. Among those who vanished was Thomas Vance, a young clerk whose cousin Elias worked in the Cinder Harbor Customs Office. Thomas had booked passage in the summer of 1889, fleeing gambling debts that threatened to land him in debtor's prison. He chose the Wake because her fares were within his meager budget and because Captain Rook's reputation suggested a man who would not ask uncomfortable questions. Elias Vance had tried to dissuade his cousin from leaving, arguing that honest work could eventually pay down the debts. But Thomas was determined to start fresh in New Eden, where his skills with numbers might earn him a position in the colonial administration. The night before departure, he pressed a small wooden crucifix into Elias's hand, a gift from their shared grandmother. The Widow's Wake sailed with the dawn tide, carrying Thomas Vance and 63 other passengers into the gray maze of the Serpent Isles. She returned 3 weeks later, her holds empty except for cargo filled with what Captain Rook declared to be salvaged goods from a merchant vessel they had discovered foundered on the rocks. The gangplank drew up and families waved goodbye. Unaware, they sailed into the belly of the beast. 3 days out from Cinder Harbor, when the last glimpse of land had vanished behind gray walls of ocean mist and the ship had entered the deepest channels between the outer Serpent Isles, Captain Rook would gather his passengers on deck for what he called a celebration of safe passage. The timing was never coincidental, always occurring when the ship reached specific coordinates that he had marked on his private charts, with symbols that looked like navigational notes but carried meanings far darker. These waters, where the ocean floor dropped away into black trenches that had never been charted by any official survey, represented the perfect combination of isolation and depth that the crew's activities required. No other ships traveled these particular channels, which were known to be treacherous and unpredictable. The nearest shipping lanes were miles away, far enough that no cry for help could be heard, and no smoke could be seen. The crew would bring up bottles of wine from the ship's stores with ceremony that befitted a sacred ritual, each bottle carefully selected from cases that bore no resemblance to any wine that could be purchased in ordinary commerce. The liquid inside was deep red and sweet, with an underlying bitterness that came from herbs gathered under specific lunar conditions and prepared according to recipes that dated back centuries. Captain Rook himself would lead the celebration with prayers of thanksgiving, his voice carrying the same conviction that had earned him respect in every port. He spoke of divine providence and protection, of the particular favor that God showed to those who trusted in His mercy while venturing into the unknown. Passengers who might have been suspicious found themselves disarmed by the captain's obvious piety. The wine was presented as a traditional maritime blessing, something that experienced sea captains did as routine when ships successfully navigated dangerous waters. Rook spoke knowledgeably of ancient customs, of rituals that had protected sailors through storms and calms across centuries of maritime history. He described the herbs as ancient remedies passed down through generations, botanical wisdom that could prevent seasickness. The herbs were indeed ancient, but their purpose was not medicinal. They had been cultivated in hidden gardens, harvested according to lunar calendars, and prepared using methods that combined chemistry with ritual. The active components induced drowsiness and paralysis, but also substances that affected consciousness in ways that made victims aware while unable to respond. Within an hour, every passenger aboard the Widow's Wake would be unconscious, or nearly so, their bodies slack while their minds remained trapped in twilight states where they could observe but not act. The crew moved among them with efficiency of men who had performed this ritual many times before, checking each passenger to ensure the drugs had taken effect. What followed was not desperate cannibalism of starving sailors, but something far more calculated and grotesque. This was systematic butchery performed according to ritualistic principles refined through years of practice, with each step carrying religious significance that transformed murder into sacrament and consumption into communion with forces the crew believed ruled the deepest places. First Mate Graves supervised the methodical cataloging of every possession with attention to detail that a museum curator might bring to valuable artifacts. Each item was examined, cleaned when necessary, and tagged with information that included not only estimated value, but details about the original owner that would be useful when creating provenance stories for sales in distant ports. The bodies themselves were processed according to dark tenets of what the crew called the Creed of the Depths, a belief system that had evolved over years of isolation into something that bore no resemblance to any recognized religion. According to their twisted theology, human flesh was not merely meat, but spiritual substance that could transfer the qualities of the consumed to the consumer, provided consumption was performed according to specific ritualistic requirements. This was their sacrament, their communion with forces they believed dwelt in the deepest trenches, ancient powers that had ruled the earth before human civilization and still demanded tribute from those who dared cross their domains. They consumed their victims not from hunger, but from faith, believing each life taken would grant them strength, cunning, and favor of whatever powers ruled the abyss. The flesh was prepared with ritualistic care that would have impressed professional butchers. Different cuts were reserved for different crew hierarchy members, with Captain Rook claiming the choicest portions as befitted his role as high priest of their cannibalistic creed. Hearts were considered most valuable, believed to contain courage and determination. Brains were reserved for senior crew members, based on belief they contained knowledge and intelligence. Children's flesh was considered especially potent, believed to carry innocence and potential that adults had lost. Pregnant women were valued even more highly, their flesh thought to contain life force of 2 souls rather than 1. These beliefs led to hierarchical consumption patterns that reflected spiritual value rather than nutritional content. If you're enjoying this investigation into maritime horror, hit subscribe because what comes next will reveal the witness who nearly exposed their cannibalistic enterprise. What remained after ritual consumption was weighted with iron chains and dropped into deepest channels between the Serpent Isles, where currents would carry evidence into oceanic trenches that had never known sunlight. The sea became both altar and grave, receiving their offerings with the same indifference it showed to legitimate shipwrecks. It was a perfect, ghastly machine, refined through years of practice. But even the most precise mechanisms have witnesses. Liam was perhaps 14 years old when they found him hiding in the cargo hold of a grain ship docked at Cinder Harbor, half dead from hunger and exposure after what must have been days of desperate concealment among sacks of wheat and barley. His age was impossible to determine precisely, malnutrition having left him smaller and frailer than healthy children of comparable years, while hardships of his unknown past had given his eyes the wary intelligence of someone much older. He spoke only broken English flavored with what might have been a Welsh accent, though his pronunciation was so affected by hunger and fear that even native Welsh speakers could not be certain of his origins. When questioned about his presence in the cargo hold, he could provide no coherent account of how he had come to be there, speaking in fragments that suggested either severe trauma or deliberate concealment of his identity. Captain Rook discovered the boy during one of his routine inspections of ships arriving in Cinder Harbor, a practice he had developed as part of careful surveillance of potential opportunities and threats. What others saw as a starving, vagrant child, Rook recognized as something potentially useful, a desperate soul with no connections or protectors who could be molded to serve purposes that required absolute discretion and unquestioning loyalty. In what appeared to be an act of Christian charity that perfectly matched his public reputation, Rook offered the boy work as a cabin boy rather than turning him over to authorities who would have sent him to the workhouse. He spoke of biblical obligations to care for orphans and strangers, quoting scripture about entertaining angels unaware and blessings that came to those who showed mercy to the helpless. The crew welcomed Liam with the same quiet efficiency they brought to all their tasks, integrating him into the ship's routines with practiced ease that spoke of experience with similar situations. They provided him with clothing appropriate to his station, taught him basic skills needed for shipboard work, and established boundaries of behavior that would keep him safe and useful. He proved to be exactly what they needed, small enough to crawl into spaces where grown men could not reach during cleaning operations, quick enough to scramble up rigging when needed during sail handling, and grateful enough to ask no questions about work assignments that might have seemed unusual. His natural intelligence allowed him to learn rapidly, while his desperate circumstances ensured he would never voluntarily leave a position that represented his only protection. For months, Liam performed his duties with dedication of someone who understood. His position was a gift he could not afford to lose through carelessness. He cleaned the captain's quarters with meticulous attention, served meals to passengers with courtesy that Rook demanded, and helped maintain ship's equipment with enthusiasm that impressed even experienced sailors. His small size and unobtrusive manner made him nearly invisible to passengers, who quickly grew accustomed to his presence and began speaking freely in front of him as if he were merely another piece of equipment. This invisibility would prove crucial to his eventual role as witness, allowing him to observe conversations and activities that the crew assumed were private. But Liam was not deaf and he was not blind, despite the crew's gradual assumption that his youth and foreign origins made him incapable of understanding the full significance of what he observed. During his second voyage, he began to notice patterns that troubled him, discrepancies between the ship's official activities and reality of what occurred once they reached deep waters. Passengers who boarded in high spirits would grow strangely quiet after celebration wine was served. The cargo holds would be reorganized overnight following these celebrations, with new compartments appearing that had not been there during loading. Most disturbing were the hushed conversations he overheard between crew members during night watches, fragments of something they called their creed that spoke of strength taken from the consumed and power drawn from ocean depths. The boys' growing horror reached its peak during a voyage in summer of 1890 when First Mate Graves pulled him aside after passengers had succumbed to their drugged wine. The mate's massive hands gripped Liam's shoulders with enough force to leave bruises, while his pale eyes fixed on the boy's face with intensity that made clear this conversation would be different. Graves explained in words that brooked no argument that the boy was no longer merely a witness, but would become a participant. The creed demanded that all who sailed with them share in their sacrament, that all who benefited from their success must contribute to their rituals in ways that made them complicit. What Liam was forced to witness and eventually to participate in, according to instructions delivered with calm authority, drove him to begin keeping a secret diary hidden beneath loose planks in his cramped sleeping quarters. The entries he made by candlelight during darkest hours detailed not just murders that occurred with systematic regularity, but nauseating specifics of how the crew prepared and consumed human flesh. He wrote of Captain Rook's prayers before each feeding, elaborate invocations that combined Christian language with older formulations that seemed to call upon forces predating recognized religion. These prayers were performed with genuine reverence, suggesting Rook truly believed he was performing sacred duties rather than justifying criminal activities. The diary documented careful distribution of body parts according to crew rank and perceived spiritual need, with different portions believed to provide different types of enhancement. Liam wrote of the crew's belief that consuming the young would grant them vitality and years added to their lifespans, while eating flesh of the elderly would provide wisdom that could not be gained through ordinary living. Each entry was dated and signed with Liam's full name, though he never revealed what that name actually was. He seemed to understand his words might someday stand as testimony, crafting descriptions with careful precision of someone who knew the importance of accurate documentation. His descriptions grew more detailed and horrified with each voyage, documenting a cannibalistic enterprise that had become as routine as any other maritime trade. His plan detailed in increasingly desperate entries that showed strain of maintaining his facade while documenting horrors no child should witness, was to escape at a port where he had no prior connections and where the crew would be less likely to track him down. He wrote of his intention to alert authorities to horrors occurring aboard the Widow's Wake, though he understood his testimony alone would not be sufficient. But the crew had grown suspicious of their cabin boy, perhaps noticing changes in behavior that reflected psychological strain of his double existence. First Mate Graves had begun watching him with cold attention of a predator evaluating prey, asking casual questions about his activities and showing unexpected interest in areas of the ship that Liam visited during cleaning duties. Liam's words would become the ghost that haunted the wake, but first the scheme would overreach. Morwenna Hale had run her pawnshop in the port of St. Anne's for 30 years, long enough to develop an eye for items that carried stories their sellers preferred to keep hidden. She dealt in the desperate commerce of sailors' wives pawning wedding rings when voyages ran long, of merchants liquidating stock after bad investments, of emigrants selling family heirlooms to pay for passage to distant shores. But in the autumn of 1890, a pattern began to emerge that troubled her sharp instincts. Sailors from the Widow's Wake had become regular customers, always arriving with carefully documented salvage from what they claimed were foundered vessels discovered during their voyages. The paperwork was always pristine, the captain's signature bold and confident, the stories of maritime charity consistent and believable. What caught Morwenna's attention was not any single item, but the strange volume and variety of personal effects that found their way to her shop. Children's toys that showed no signs of saltwater damage, women's jewelry that bore no scratches from being thrown against rocks, family photographs in frames that remained uncracked despite their supposed ordeal at sea. Each piece was clean, carefully preserved, and accompanied by documentation that would satisfy any customs official. The pawnshop itself was a cramped maze of shelves and display cases, filled with the accumulated detritus of human hope and desperation. Morwenna had learned to read the stories behind every item that crossed her counter, to distinguish between genuine need and calculated deception, to spot the telltale signs that separated honest sales from criminal disposal of stolen goods. She maintained detailed records of every transaction, noting not just the items and prices, but also her observations about the sellers themselves. Over the years, she had developed a network of contacts among port authorities and shipping officials who valued her insights about suspicious activities and unusual patterns in the maritime trade. The moment of recognition came when she noticed a small wooden horse among the items offered by First Mate Graves, its hand-carved details so distinctive that she immediately recalled seeing it described in a missing persons notice that had been circulated months earlier. The toy belonged to the youngest child of a German family that had disappeared while emigrating to New Eden, their fate unknown until this moment. The wooden horse was exquisitely crafted, obviously the work of a skilled woodcarver who had spent considerable time on the details that made it special. The mane was carved to show individual strands. The eyes had been painted with tiny dots of white that gave them lifelike expression, and the base bore initials that had been carved with the careful precision of someone creating a treasured gift. Morwenna waited until Graves completed his transaction and departed before retrieving the crumpled notice from her files. The description matched perfectly, down to the tiny scratch on the horse's left ear that had been mentioned as a distinguishing characteristic, and the specific pattern of initials carved into its base. She stared at the bill of sale that Graves had provided, studying the captain's signature and the official seal that declared the items to be legitimate salvage. The documentation appeared flawless at first glance, complete with witness signatures and port authority stamps that would have satisfied most inspectors. But Morwenna's years of experience had taught her to look for subtle inconsistencies that might reveal forgery or fraud, and something about the papers struck her as too perfect, too carefully prepared. That evening she carried both the toy and the notice to Constable Gideon Hull, the only law enforcement officer in St. Anne's whom she considered both honest and competent. Hull was a methodical man who had built his reputation on careful investigation and attention to detail, qualities that had made him unpopular with merchants who preferred quick resolutions to uncomfortable questions. Hull examined the evidence with growing alarm, recognizing the implications immediately. If the toy was indeed from the missing German family, and if similar items were being sold regularly by the Wake's crew, then something far more sinister than shipwrecks was occurring in the shipping lanes. The coincidence of finding such a distinctive item among supposed salvage from an unrelated wreck was too improbable to accept without investigation. He spent the night reviewing his files for similar cases, cross-referencing missing persons reports with salvage claims filed by various ships operating in the region. What he discovered was a pattern of disappearances that corresponded closely with the Wake's schedule of voyages, though the connections were subtle enough that no single incident had triggered suspicion. Hull confronted Graves the next morning as the wake prepared to depart St. Anne's Harbor, approaching the first mate with the wooden horse and the missing persons notice as evidence of potential wrongdoing. The first mate received the accusation with the same stolid silence that characterized all his interactions, his massive frame betraying no sign of concern or surprise as he examined the items. Graves produced the salvage documentation without hesitation, answering the constable's questions with mechanical precision that suggested rehearsed responses rather than spontaneous explanations. Every detail of his story was consistent, every piece of paperwork was in order, every legal requirement had been fulfilled according to maritime law and custom. When pressed about the specific circumstances of the alleged wreck, Graves provided a detailed account of discovering the foundered vessel on the outer reefs of the Serpent Isles, describing the condition of the wreck and the process of recovering salvageable items with the expertise of someone who had dealt with such situations many times before. Frustrated but lacking concrete evidence of wrongdoing beyond suspicious coincidence, Hull demanded permission to search the ship for additional evidence that might support his growing suspicions. Captain Rook granted permission with the gracious cooperation of a man who had nothing to hide, even offering to assist the search personally as evidence of his commitment to resolving any misunderstandings. The search was thorough but ultimately unsuccessful, hampered by the crew's helpful cooperation and Hull's unfamiliarity with the complexities of maritime equipment and practices. The cargo holds revealed nothing more suspicious than normal shipping supplies. The crew's quarters contained only personal effects that seemed consistent with their stated occupations, and the ship's documentation appeared to be in perfect order. Captain Rook himself guided Hull through the search with patient explanations of everything they encountered, demonstrating his knowledge of maritime law and his willingness to submit to official scrutiny. His manner was that of a man whose conscience was clear and whose only concern was resolving the constable's concerns as quickly and completely as possible. The law looked the monster in the eye and blinked first, unable to penetrate the careful facade that years of practice had perfected. Elias Vance had never been a man given to obsession, but his cousin Thomas's disappearance aboard the Widow's Wake consumed him with a fury that surprised even himself. Working in the customs office gave him access to shipping records that most investigators could never examine, and he began spending his evenings poring over manifests, port declarations, and cargo inventories with the dedication of a scholar pursuing forbidden knowledge. His position as a junior customs clerk was modest but strategic, providing him with legitimate access to the bureaucratic machinery that tracked maritime commerce throughout the region. He understood the systems and procedures that governed shipping better than most law enforcement officials, having spent years processing the paperwork that documented every vessel's movements and declared cargo. The customs office itself was a labyrinth of filing cabinets and record books, containing decades of accumulated documentation that few people ever bothered to examine comprehensively. Most officials dealt with current transactions and recent records, leaving the older files to gather dust in storage areas that were seldom visited except by clerks looking for specific historical precedents. Elias began his investigation by pulling every record related to the Widow's Wake, creating a comprehensive timeline of her activities that revealed patterns invisible to casual inspection. What he discovered was a story told in numbers and dates that defied logical explanation when examined as a complete picture rather than isolated incidents. Over the course of 3 years, the Wake had declared salvage operations on no fewer than 17 separate occasions, each time discovering foundered vessels in the treacherous waters around the Serpent Isles. The declared value of these salvaged goods was astronomical, far exceeding what any legitimate merchant vessel would carry through such dangerous waters. especially considering the frequency with which such discoveries occurred. More troubling still was the pattern of passenger manifests that Elias discovered in the archives. The wake consistently boarded passengers in groups of 60 to 80 souls, families and individuals whose names were carefully recorded by port authorities as required by colonial regulations. But when the ship returned from her voyages, those passenger lists were conspicuously absent from her documentation. Captain Rook's explanations for these discrepancies varied but followed similar themes. Passengers had disembarked at intermediate ports, where record-keeping was less rigorous. Plans had changed during voyages due to weather or mechanical issues. Families had decided to settle in colonial way stations rather than continuing to their original destinations. Each explanation was plausible in isolation, backed by documentation that appeared legitimate and signed by appropriate authorities. But taken together, these explanations formed a pattern that made Elias's hands shake as he turned the pages of dusty ledgers late into the night. The statistical probability of so many passengers changing their plans so consistently, combined with the extraordinary frequency of valuable salvage discoveries, suggested something far more sinister than coincidence or good fortune. He began cross-referencing the wake's salvage declarations with the passenger lists of ships that had genuinely been lost at sea, searching for connections that might explain the extraordinary volume of personal effects that the crew consistently brought to port. What he found were gaps and inconsistencies that suggested a systematic pattern of deception spanning years of operations. The breakthrough came when Elias discovered a wooden crate in the customs storage facility that had been misfiled and forgotten for months. The crate bore Captain Rook's personal seal and contained documents that had been wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture, suggesting they were considered valuable enough to preserve with unusual care. Inside the crate was a ledger bound in black leather that contained entries written in a code that bore no resemblance to standard maritime record-keeping or commercial bookkeeping practices. The pages were filled with columns of numbers and symbols that seemed to follow some internal logic, but the meaning was obscure to anyone unfamiliar with the system being used. Working by lamplight in his cramped apartment, surrounded by shipping records and reference materials borrowed from the customs office, Elias spent weeks attempting to decipher the cryptic entries. He approached the problem with the methodical patience of someone trained in bureaucratic procedures, testing various theories about the code's structure and meaning. The ledger contained two primary columns of information, one clearly representing monetary values, while the other consisted of tally marks and symbols that seemed to follow patterns related to the ship's voyage schedule. Gradually, through painstaking comparison with the wake's official records, he began to understand that the monetary column corresponded to auction proceeds from salvaged goods sold in various ports. The second column proved far more sinister when its meaning became clear. The tally marks, when compared to passenger manifests from the ship's voyages, appeared to correspond exactly to the number of souls who had boarded the wake on each trip. But these were not simple passenger counts maintained for administrative purposes. They were something far more disturbing. Each tally mark was accompanied by small symbols that seemed to denote different categories or classifications, markings that made no sense until Elias realized they might represent ages, genders, or some other system of human categorization that had nothing to do with legitimate passenger services. The symbols appeared to follow patterns that suggested deliberate organization rather than random notation. The most chilling discovery came when Elias noticed that certain entries in the ledger were marked with what appeared to be dates corresponding to phases of the moon, particularly new moons when the night sky was darkest. The pattern suggested that whatever was being recorded in the second column was not random, but followed a deliberate schedule tied to celestial events. Additional symbols appeared beside some entries that seemed to indicate special categories or circumstances, markings that became more frequent in later pages, as if the system had evolved to become more detailed and specific over time. Some entries were marked with what looked like crosses, others with symbols that resembled maritime flags, and still others with markings that had no obvious meaning but clearly held significance for whoever maintained the records. The timing patterns revealed in the ledger corresponded closely with the ship's schedule of passenger voyages, but also with reports of missing vessels and unexplained disappearances that had been filed with various port authorities throughout the region. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental, suggesting a level of systematic planning that transformed isolated incidents into components of a larger enterprise. When the code finally broke and its meaning became clear, the tallies told a story more terrifying than any ghost story that sailors shared during long watches. The ledger was not a record of commercial transactions, but a catalog of human lives, a systematic accounting of souls that had been harvested rather than transported to their intended destinations. Armed with the deciphered ledger and its horrifying implications, Elias Vance knew he possessed evidence that could expose the truth about the widow's wake, but he also understood that his position as a junior customs clerk would carry little weight against a respected sea captain with years of established reputation. He needed an ally with authority, someone whose word would be believed when the accusations seemed too monstrous for civilized minds to accept. Constable Gideon Hull of St. Anne's had been wrestling with his own suspicions about Captain Rook and his crew since the incident with the wooden horse had first brought the wake to his attention. When Elias arrived at his office with the coded ledger and detailed analysis of its contents, Hull recognized immediately that the two separate investigations had uncovered different pieces of the same nightmarish puzzle. The constable's office was a small room above the harbor master's building, furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, and filing cabinets that contained records of every significant crime committed in the port over the past decade. Hull was known for his methodical approach to investigations, his willingness to pursue uncomfortable truths, regardless of their implications for local commerce, and his reputation for honesty in a profession where corruption was often more profitable than integrity. Together they spent the long hours of a winter night, studying the evidence, comparing the ledger entries with missing persons reports, cross-referencing the tally marks with passenger manifests, and building a comprehensive case that would stand up to official scrutiny. The pattern was undeniable, the correlation too precise to be dismissed as coincidence, but both men understood that accusations of mass murder and ritualistic cannibalism would require evidence so overwhelming that no court could ignore it. They constructed a timeline that showed the wake's movements in relation to reported disappearances, documenting a pattern of activity that had been invisible when examined as isolated incidents but became horrifyingly clear when viewed as components of a systematic enterprise. The financial records showed profits that were impossible to explain through legitimate salvage operations, while the coded symbols revealed a level of organization that suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic crime. The widow's wake was scheduled to dock at St. Anne's the following evening, returning from what Captain Rook had declared would be his final voyage of the season before the ship entered winter quarters for maintenance and repairs. Hull and Elias agreed that this would be their only opportunity to confront Rook while the evidence was still intact, and before the crew could disperse or the ledger could mysteriously disappear from the customs facility. They prepared their approach carefully, knowing that they would have only one chance to present their case before Rook's legal and political connections could be mobilized to protect him. Hull arranged for backup constables to be available if the confrontation escalated, while Elias ensured that copies of the most crucial documents were secured in multiple locations where they could not be easily destroyed or stolen. They boarded the wake as she tied up at the wharf just after sunset, Hull's constable's badge providing the legal authority to demand entry, while Elias carried the original ledger wrapped in oilcloth against the evening drizzle that had begun to fall as the ship approached port. The fog that rolled in with the tide provided appropriate atmosphere for a confrontation that would determine whether justice could be achieved or whether the truth would be buried beneath layers of official indifference. Captain Rook received them in his cabin with the same calm courtesy that had served him so well in deflecting previous inquiries, offering tea from his personal service and expressing polite concern about the nature of their official business. His manner was that of a man accustomed to dealing with bureaucratic formalities, someone who understood that cooperation and respect for authority were the best ways to resolve misunderstandings quickly and quietly. The cabin itself reflected Rook's dual nature as both devout Christian and practical sea captain, with religious texts and navigational charts, sharing space on shelves that also held personal mementos and official documents. A large cross hung above his desk, while maritime flags and signal pennants decorated the walls in patterns that spoke of years of faithful service and professional competence. Hull laid out the evidence methodically, explaining the discrepancies in passenger records, the impossible volume and frequency of salvage operations, and the coded ledger that seemed to document something far more sinister than legitimate maritime commerce. He presented each piece of evidence carefully, building a case that became more compelling with each additional detail and correlation. Throughout the presentation, Rook maintained an expression of mild interest mixed with appropriate concern, occasionally nodding as if following a particularly complex explanation of navigational procedures or commercial regulations. His responses to questions were measured and thoughtful, demonstrating familiarity with maritime law and customs that suggested innocent explanations for apparent irregularities. When Hull finished laying out the accusation and demanded an explanation for the evidence they had uncovered, Rook studied the open ledger for a long moment before responding. His voice carried the same measured authority that had commanded respect in every port from Cinder Harbor to New Eden, the calm confidence of someone accustomed to being believed when he spoke. He neither confirmed nor denied the constable's interpretations of the coded entries, instead speaking in general terms about the mysteries of the sea, the ancient hungers that dwelt in the deepest waters, and the bargains that men sometimes made with forces beyond their understanding when faced with circumstances that tested their faith and resolve. As Rook spoke, his words taking on an almost hypnotic quality that seemed to fill the cabin with significance. Beyond their literal meaning, a strange glow began to flicker through the windows. What had begun as the normal illumination of dock lanterns and ship's lights gradually intensified into something more urgent and threatening, accompanied by the acrid smell of smoke that had nothing to do with the coal fires that normally heated the harbor district. Shouts erupted from the deck above as crew members discovered that a fire had somehow started in the cargo hold, flames spreading with unnatural speed through the ship's timber frame, despite the damp conditions that should have slowed any accidental ignition. The fire seemed to have multiple points of origin, as if it had been deliberately set in several locations simultaneously to ensure maximum destruction. In the chaos that followed, as Hull and Elias fought their way through smoke-filled corridors toward the gangplank, the precious ledger was lost. Whether it fell from Elias's hands in the confusion of the evacuation or was deliberately taken by someone who understood its significance, neither man could say with certainty when they finally reached the safety of the wharf and turned to watch the ship burn. The widow's wake was consumed by flames that reached toward the night sky like grasping fingers, the fire burning with an intensity that suggested accelerants had been used to ensure complete destruction of evidence. Captain Rook and his crew had vanished into the smoke and darkness, leaving behind only the burning shell of their floating slaughterhouse and the memory of a voice speaking calmly of ancient hungers and oceanic bargains. As the widow's wake burned, consuming not only timber and canvas but also the physical evidence that might have brought justice to her victims, it seemed that the truth would be consumed with it, buried beneath the waves along with the ship that had served as both crime scene and weapon in an enterprise too monstrous for civilized society to acknowledge. 3 days after the widow's wake burned to her waterline and sank in the deep channel beyond St. Anne's Harbor, a fisherman working the shallows discovered a waterlogged canvas bag caught in his nets. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and miraculously preserved despite its submersion in seawater, were the final pages of what appeared to be a diary written in a mixture of English and Welsh. The fisherman, unable to read the entries himself, brought the pages to Constable Hull, recognizing them as potentially related to the recent investigation that had consumed the port's attention. Hull recognized immediately that he was looking at the missing piece of a puzzle that had consumed his thoughts since the night of the fire. The diary pages were water-stained and partially damaged, but the words were still legible enough to provide testimony that would transform horrifying suspicions into documented fact. The handwriting was that of someone young and inexperienced, but the content revealed a maturity born of witnessing horrors that no child should ever see. The diary belonged to the cabin boy Liam, and its pages contained first-hand accounts of activities aboard the widow's wake that confirmed the worst fears that Hull and Elias had developed during their investigation. Written in a desperate hand that grew increasingly unsteady with each entry, the diary described in explicit detail the ritualistic nature of what the crew called their creed of the depths. The cannibalism was not born of starvation or desperation, as Hull and Elias had initially assumed when trying to rationalize evidence that seemed too monstrous to believe. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated sacrament based on the crew's twisted belief that consuming the flesh of hopeful emigrants would transfer their strength, their dreams, and their future prosperity to those who partook of the ritual. Each victim was selected not randomly, but according to specific criteria that had been developed through years of experimentation and religious contemplation. Their ages and circumstances were chosen to maximize what the crew believed would be the spiritual benefit of their consumption, with different types of passengers providing different categories of enhancement to those who consumed them. Liam's entries described Captain Rook leading prayers before each feeding, elaborate invocations that combined familiar Christian language with older formulations that seemed to call upon forces that predated any recognized religion. These prayers were performed with genuine reverence and conviction, suggesting that Rook truly believed he was performing sacred duties ordained by higher powers rather than simply justifying criminal activities to himself and his followers. The crew believed they were serving ancient powers that had dwelt in the deepest trenches of the ocean since before human civilization began, primordial forces that demanded human sacrifice in exchange for protection during storms, favorable winds for their voyages, and supernatural insight that would help them identify the most vulnerable and spiritually valuable passengers. But the most nauseating details in the diary concerned the actual consumption itself, described with the clinical precision of someone who had been forced to participate in activities that violated every natural instinct. Liam wrote of the crew's elaborate beliefs about which parts of the human body provided which types of spiritual benefits, theories that had been developed through years of experimentation and careful observation of results. Hearts were considered the most valuable portions, believed to contain the courage and determination of their original owners in concentrated form. The crew competed for access to the hearts of passengers who had shown particular bravery during boarding or during the early days of voyages, believing that consuming the heart of a brave person would make the consumer braver and more resolute in facing future challenges. Brains were reserved for senior crew members, based on the belief that they contained the knowledge and intelligence of their owners in forms that could be absorbed and integrated by those who consumed them. Educated passengers identified through their possessions and conversations during the early days of voyages were particularly prized for this purpose, with different parts of the brain assigned to different crew members based on their responsibilities and perceived needs. The flesh of children was considered especially potent, believed to carry the innocence and unlimited potential that adults had lost through years of moral compromise and failed ambitions. Pregnant women were valued even more highly, their flesh thought to contain the life force of two souls rather than one, providing double the spiritual nourishment to those fortunate enough to partake of such rare opportunities. The tally marks in the coded ledger, which Elias had interpreted as simple counts maintained for administrative purposes, were revealed through Liam's testimony to be something far more disturbing. Each mark represented not just a life that had been taken, but a specific type of spiritual nourishment that the crew believed they had gained through ritualistic consumption. The symbols beside each tally mark indicated which crew member had consumed which portions, creating a grotesque accounting system for their cannibalistic communion that ensured fair distribution of spiritual benefits according to rank and perceived need. Senior crew members received priority access to the most valuable portions, while junior members were assigned lesser cuts that were still considered spiritually significant. Most chilling of all were Liam's descriptions of how the crew prepared themselves for each ritual feeding, elaborate purification procedures that transformed murder into sacrament through careful attention to spiritual preparation. They would fast for days beforehand, purging their bodies of conventional food to make room for the spiritual nourishment they believed came from consuming human flesh according to their sacred formulas. Captain Rook would read from a handwritten book that contained what he claimed were translations of texts recovered from sunken ships, ancient wisdom passed down through generations of sailors who had made similar bargains with the powers that ruled the deepest places of the earth. These readings were performed with the solemnity of religious services, complete with responses from the crew that had been memorized through repetition over multiple ceremonies. The lunar timing that Elias had noticed in the ledger was explained by Liam's account of the crew's belief that certain phases of the moon made their cannibalistic rituals more powerful and spiritually significant. During new moons, when the night sky was darkest and the ocean seemed to swallow all light, they believed their communion with the deep powers was strongest, and the flesh they consumed would be most nourishing to both body and spirit. The diary revealed that the crew saw themselves not as murderers or criminals, but as priests of a faith that was older than civilization, men who had been chosen to serve appetites and purposes that most landlubbers could never comprehend. They believed that each passenger who boarded their ship had been delivered to them by the same oceanic forces they served, that fate itself conspired to provide them with the sacrifices their creed demanded. This was not butchery born of desperation or need, but sacrament performed in service to what they considered the deepest truth about the nature of power and survival in a world where the strong consumed the weak as a matter of divine order. The official inquest into the destruction of the Widow's Wake convened in the harbor office of St. Anne's 3 weeks after the fire, presided over by a magistrate who had sailed from the colonial capital with a clear mandate to resolve the matter quickly and quietly. The proceedings bore all the hallmarks of bureaucratic efficiency designed more to close files than to uncover truth, complete with pre-printed forms and predetermined conclusions that left little room for inconvenient questions or uncomfortable revelations. Magistrate Cornelius Ashworth was a man who had built his career on the principle that the smooth functioning of commercial enterprises took precedence over individual concerns about justice or accountability. His appointment to investigate the Wake incident was less about discovering facts than about providing official validation for conclusions that had already been reached by authorities more concerned with maintaining confidence in maritime trade than pursuing criminal prosecution. Constable Hull presented his evidence methodically, describing the suspicious salvage operations that had generated impossible profits, the pattern of missing passengers whose names appeared on departure manifests but never on arrival records, and the coded ledger that had documented what appeared to be systematic murder on a scale that defied belief. He spoke with the passion of someone who had dedicated months to uncovering truth, but his testimony fell on ears that were already closed to anything that might disrupt established narratives. He detailed the discovery of personal effects from missing passengers being sold in ports hundreds of miles from where their owners had last been seen alive, the statistical impossibility of the Wake's claimed salvage operations, and the diary pages that provided first-hand testimony of ritualistic cannibalism performed as religious sacrament. His presentation was comprehensive and damning, supported by documentation that would have convinced any impartial observer of the validity of his conclusions. But Magistrate Ashworth spent most of the hearing reviewing shipping schedules and customs documentation that had no bearing on the specific charges being presented, asking questions about bureaucratic procedures while ignoring the substance of Hull's testimony. When Hull attempted to introduce Liam's diary pages as evidence, Ashworth dismissed them as unreliable hearsay from an unknown source whose credibility could not be established. The official finding blamed the fire on a dock worker's carelessly discarded lantern, a conclusion supported by testimony from 3 witnesses whose stories were suspiciously similar in detail and whose ability to recall specific events with perfect clarity seemed remarkably convenient. These witnesses, who had not come forward during the initial investigation, suddenly appeared with sworn statements that corroborated the official explanation while contradicting physical evidence that suggested multiple points of ignition. Captain Rook and his crew were not only absolved of any responsibility for the blaze, but were praised for their heroic efforts to contain the fire and evacuate the area before it could spread to other vessels. Their subsequent disappearance was explained as a natural response to the trauma of losing their livelihood and narrowly escaping death in the flames, with official sympathy expressed for mariners who had lost everything through no fault of their own. The inquest's conclusions were distributed to port authorities throughout the region as the definitive account of the incident, establishing the official narrative that would prevent further investigation or inquiry. Any future questions about the Wake or her crew would be answered by reference to these findings, effectively closing the case in the eyes of colonial administration. Within days of the inquest's conclusion, work crews arrived with unusual haste to dispose of the Wake's burned hulk, which had been listing in the harbor since the fire and posed what officials claimed was a significant navigation hazard. Rather than attempting salvage operations that might have recovered evidence from the ship's interior, authorities ordered the wreck to be towed to deep water and scuttled without examination. The disposal operation was conducted with military precision and secrecy that seemed excessive for routine harbor maintenance. Officials cited concerns about structural integrity and the danger of toxic fumes from burned materials, but observers noted that the crew involved in the scuttling appeared to be following specific instructions about which parts of the wreck required special attention during the destruction process. Captain Silas Rook and his 15 crew members vanished as completely as if the ocean itself had opened to swallow them, leaving no trace in any official records or unofficial reports from the maritime community that typically tracked the movements of experienced sailors. No subsequent shipping records contained their names. No port authorities reported their arrival seeking new employment, and no witnesses came forward claiming to have seen them in the months and years that followed their disappearance. The completeness of their vanishing was remarkable, even by the standards of men who made their livings on the sea, where sudden departures and assumed identities were not uncommon among those fleeing debts or legal complications. Professional sailors were typically known in multiple ports, their reputations and skills making them valuable enough that ship owners would maintain contact even during extended absences. Elias Vance found his position at the customs office terminated within a month of the inquest, his supervisors citing concerns about his mental stability and his obsessive focus on conspiracy theories that reflected poorly on the department's reputation for professional competence. His attempts to interest other law enforcement agencies in continuing the Wake investigation were met with polite dismissal and suggestions that he seek employment in fields less demanding of rational judgment and emotional stability. His personnel file, which had previously contained nothing but positive evaluations and commendations for thorough work, suddenly filled with reports of erratic behavior and unreliable performance that provided administrative justification for his dismissal. Colleagues who had worked with him for years were encouraged to submit statements detailing incidents that cast doubt on his professional capabilities and personal character. Constable Hull suffered a similar fate, receiving transfer orders that assigned him to a remote outpost where his primary duties involved mediating disputes between sheep farmers and documenting minor infractions of colonial livestock regulations. The assignment was presented as a promotion that recognized his dedication to law enforcement, but the reality was banishment to a position where his investigative skills would be wasted on trivial matters. His requests for reassignment were denied with increasing firmness, and his attempts to continue investigating maritime crimes were blocked by superiors who questioned his fitness for duties that required sound judgment and political sensitivity. The official explanation cited his need for rest and recovery from the stress of recent cases, but the message was clear that further pursuit of the Wake investigation would end his career permanently. The story of the widow's wake was systematically erased from official records, reduced to a footnote about a shipping accident that claimed no lives and posed no ongoing threat to maritime commerce or public safety. Port authorities issued new guidelines emphasizing the importance of proper lantern disposal and fire prevention. Dock workers received additional training in safety procedures, and the Colonial administration congratulated itself on resolving a potential scandal before it could damage trade relationships or public confidence. But suppressing truth and eliminating it entirely were different endeavors, and the legend of Captain Rook and his Cannibal crew proved more resilient than bureaucratic efficiency could contain, surviving in whispered stories and fragmentary evidence that official denial could not completely erase. More than a century has passed since the widow's wake burned in St. Anne's Harbor, but the legend refuses to sink beneath the waves of forgotten history, like so many other maritime mysteries that time has claimed. The story persists in academic circles and amateur investigations, surfacing periodically when researchers stumble across fragments of evidence that official records claimed never existed. Maritime historians occasionally encounter references to the case while researching colonial shipping records for other purposes, finding gaps in passenger manifests that raise uncomfortable questions about what happened to immigrants who simply vanished between one port and another. These researchers, working in archives that few people visit, discover patterns that suggest the wake was not unique, but part of a broader phenomenon that authorities preferred not to acknowledge. University libraries contain doctoral dissertations that mention the case in footnotes, academic papers that treat it as an example of maritime folklore rather than documented history, and conference presentations that dismiss it as a cautionary tale about the unreliability of historical testimony. But even these dismissive treatments preserve details that more comprehensive suppression might have eliminated entirely. In 1973, a private collector of nautical memorabilia acquired several water-stained pages at an estate auction in Halifax, documents that proved to be additional entries from Liam's diary that had somehow survived the decades since the wake's destruction. These pages, preserved behind glass in a climate-controlled display case, provide the most explicit surviving testimony about the crew's cannibalistic practices and their religious justifications for systematic murder. The collector, an elderly maritime enthusiast who had spent his retirement accumulating artifacts related to shipping history, initially dismissed the diary pages as an elaborate hoax created to enhance their value among collectors of macabre memorabilia. But expert analysis of the paper, ink, and writing style confirmed their apparent age and authenticity, forcing a reconsideration of their historical significance. Scholars who have studied these entries note the psychological deterioration evident in the handwriting, the way Welsh words become more frequent as the writer's horror overwhelms his ability to express himself in English, and the increasing urgency that suggests someone who understood his time was running short. The technical details about ship operations and maritime practices demonstrate knowledge that would have been difficult for a modern forger to acquire and reproduce convincingly. The fate of Captain Rook and his crew remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of maritime history, with theories ranging from the prosaic to the supernatural. Some researchers theorize that they simply adopted new identities and continued their predatory practices under different names, pointing to similar patterns of disappearances on other shipping routes during the 1890s that might represent the continuation of their activities. Others suggest that they may have fallen victim to their own beliefs, that whatever oceanic powers they claimed to serve eventually demanded their own lives as payment for years of faithful service. This theory is supported by maritime folklore from various cultures that describe similar cults eventually consuming themselves when their supernatural patrons grew tired of indirect offerings and demanded the ultimate sacrifice from their worshippers. More disturbing are the claims by some folklorists that the creed of the depths was not unique to Rook's crew, that similar beliefs have surfaced among sailors throughout history whenever men spend too long staring into the abyss and begin to see things that civilized minds reject as impossible. They point to other maritime mysteries, other ships that returned with implausible salvage stories and passenger lists that never quite matched their departure records. These researchers have compiled catalogs of suspicious incidents spanning centuries of maritime history, patterns that suggest the wake was not an isolated case, but part of a tradition that predates written history and continues to influence those who make their livings on the sea. Their work is generally dismissed by mainstream historians as conspiracy theorizing, but the correlations they document are difficult to explain through conventional analysis. The Grey Serpent Isles themselves have become a subject of morbid fascination for amateur investigators and paranormal researchers who believe that physical evidence of the crew's activities might still be recoverable from the deep channels where bodies were disposed. Despite their reputation as a navigation hazard that claims vessels regularly, the islands attract visitors who search for evidence of mass graves or ritual sites that might corroborate the legend. Modern diving equipment has made it possible to explore areas that were inaccessible to 19th century investigators, and several expeditions have reported finding unusual bone fragments and metallic objects that might be related to the wake's operations. However, marine biologists consistently identify these remains as belonging to large sea mammals rather than human victims, while the metallic objects are typically explained as debris from more recent shipwrecks. Local fishing crews continue to report finding unusual items in their nets. When working the waters around the serpents, though they are generally reluctant to discuss these discoveries with outsiders who might bring unwanted attention from authorities or researchers. The fragments they describe, when they can be convinced to talk at all, typically consist of personal effects that show no signs of the deterioration that would be expected from century-old artifacts recovered from seawater. Modern psychologists who have studied the surviving diary pages and historical accounts note parallels between the crew's belief system and other instances of collective delusion documented in isolated communities, cases where shared fantasies develop to justify behaviors that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. They suggest that the creed of the depths may have been a psychological coping mechanism that allowed ordinary men to commit extraordinary atrocities by reframing murder as religious duty. These analyses typically focus on the social dynamics that enabled such beliefs to develop and persist, examining how isolation, stress, and charismatic leadership can combine to create environments where moral boundaries dissolve and participants convince themselves that evil acts serve higher purposes. The psychological literature contains numerous examples of similar phenomena, though few involve systematic cannibalism performed as religious sacrament. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Widow's Wake legend is how easily its essential elements could be repeated in the modern world, where global migration and desperate refugees create populations of vulnerable people who must trust strangers with their lives. Every year, thousands of people disappear while attempting dangerous crossings in vessels operated by individuals whose motives and methods are never subjected to scrutiny. The story serves as a warning about the vulnerability of those who have no choice but to place their faith in the promises of others, particularly when those promises seem too good to be true, or when official oversight is minimal or non-existent. The emigrants who boarded the wake were not naive or careless, but desperate people making rational decisions based on incomplete information, exactly like millions of modern refugees and migrants. In an age of satellite tracking and global communications, it might seem impossible for entire groups of people to simply vanish without trace, but the reality is that vast areas of the world's oceans remain beyond effective monitoring, and the bureaucratic machinery that tracks human movement is far from comprehensive or reliable. The wake of the Widow's Wake stretches far longer than any ship's timber, reaching across decades and continents to touch anyone who has ever trusted a stranger with their life, or wondered what happened to those who disappeared while seeking better futures for themselves and their families. What can we say with certainty about the crew of the Widow's Wake after more than a century? Of official denial and deliberate forgetting? The records that survive, despite systematic attempts to erase them, speak to a truth that bureaucratic convenience could never fully bury. The official story tells us only of a shipping accident, a routine fire that claimed a vessel but no lives, a bureaucratic footnote in the vast machinery of maritime commerce that processes thousands of similar incidents without comment or concern. But the gaps in those official records tell a different story entirely, one written in the negative space between passenger manifests that list hopeful emigrants boarding ships and arrival records that never document their safe delivery to promised destinations. The story emerges from auction receipts for personal effects that somehow survived shipwrecks that claimed their owners, from missing persons reports that were filed and forgotten, from testimony that was dismissed as unreliable because it described horrors that civilized minds preferred not to acknowledge. The belongings remain the most damning evidence, personal effects that outlived their owners by decades, and found their way into markets hundreds of miles from where loving hands had first packed them into trunks and traveling bags. A child's wooden toy, carved with the patience and skill that only parental love can inspire. A grandmother's silver locket, polished smooth by generations of wear and carrying miniature portraits of ancestors who had overcome their own hardships through faith and determination. A father's tools shaped by years of honest labor and representing both livelihood and legacy. All of these treasures severed from the lives that gave them meaning and transformed into mere commodities by men who saw human beings as resources to be harvested rather than souls to be transported safely to new lives. The systematic nature of this commerce, the careful documentation and professional presentation that accompanied each sale, speaks to an enterprise that was both ruthlessly practical and utterly inhuman. Perhaps the most frightening aspect of the story is not the cannibalism itself, grotesque as those practices were, but the methodical business-like approach that the crew brought to their activities. This was not the desperate improvisation of shipwrecked sailors driven to extremes by starvation and despair, nor was it the savage impulse of madmen who had lost all connection to human morality. Instead, it was a calculated commercial operation that treated human lives as inventory and human flesh as sacrament, a systematic enterprise that converted hope into profit with industrial efficiency. The crew had created a machine for processing human beings, complete with standardized procedures for drugging victims, ritualistic methods for consuming their flesh according to religious principles, and sophisticated systems for disposing of evidence and marketing recovered possessions. Every aspect of their operations showed careful planning and continuous refinement, suggesting years of experience and ongoing improvement of their methods. The monster in this tale did not emerge from the depths of the ocean, despite what Captain Rook and his followers may have believed about the ancient powers they claimed to serve. The true horror was entirely human in origin, born not from supernatural hunger or oceanic malevolence, but from the capacity of ordinary men to justify extraordinary evil when it serves purposes they consider important enough to override moral constraints. They convinced themselves that their cannibalistic rituals were acts of faith rather than acts of murder, that consuming human flesh was a sacrament ordained by forces older and wiser than human law or Christian morality. They developed elaborate theological frameworks to support their practices, creating a complete belief system that transformed victims into willing sacrifices and predators into priests serving divine purposes. The widow's wake reminds us that the greatest predators are often those who offer salvation, that evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs, but more commonly appears wearing masks of charity and speaking languages of faith and hope. The families who boarded that ship were not naive victims who ignored obvious warning signs, but rational people making careful decisions based on information that seemed reliable and trustworthy. Captain Rook's reputation for Christian piety and fair dealing was not accidental but carefully cultivated over years of consistent behavior designed to build exactly the kind of trust that would bring vulnerable people within reach of his true purposes. His evening prayers and biblical quotations were not hypocrisy but genuine expressions of faith that had been twisted into justifications for acts that conventional Christianity would have condemned without reservation. If you've made it this far in our investigation into the darkest chapters of maritime history, consider subscribing because the archives hold other stories that reveal how thin the line between civilization and savagery truly is. Other accounts of ordinary people who discovered that the deepest hungers are not always satisfied by conventional means, and other reminders that the most dangerous monsters are often those who convince us they are our protectors. The legacy of the widow's wake extends far beyond the specific crimes committed by her crew, serving as a warning about the vulnerability of those who must trust strangers with their lives, and the ease with which systematic evil can disguise itself as legitimate enterprise. In every age, desperate people seeking better lives become prey for those who understand how to exploit hope and desperation for purposes that serve appetites civilization prefers not to acknowledge. Some ships carry cargo across the oceans, connecting distant ports in networks of commerce that bind the world together through trade and mutual benefit. Others carry hope, transporting people toward futures that promise dignity and prosperity in exchange for courage and hard work. But the widow's wake carried something else entirely, an appetite that fed on human dreams and sustained itself through consumption that transformed passengers into sacrament and turned the promise of new life into the reality of death, served according to rituals that belonged to ages when men believed the sea demanded human sacrifice in exchange for safe passage. The story ends not with justice or closure, but with the recognition that some hungers are never satisfied, and some truths are too disturbing for official acknowledgement. The crew of the widow's wake vanished into legend, but the appetites they served continue to prowl the deep waters where desperate souls seek passage to better lives. Their legacy lives on, not in monuments or memorials, but in the empty spaces of official records, in the gaps between departure manifests and arrival logs, in the silence that follows when families ask authorities what happened to loved ones who simply disappeared while crossing waters that have swallowed secrets for centuries. Some ships carry cargo, others carry hope. The widow's wake carried an appetite that could never be satisfied, no matter how many souls fed its insatiable hunger for human flesh and human dreams.